So, Thomas, the Congressional Review Act. This is what kept Donald Trump and the Republicans quite busy in 2017. Tell us the origins of this act and what it does.
Okay. Yes, it kept the Trump administration very busy for just 5 months of 2017, as it turns out, because of how the act is written. This was one of the few regulatory reform measures that were promised by Newt Gingrich and the Republicans back in 1994, in the elections of 1994, in the contract with America. They promised a lot of changes to the regulatory system. This is one of the few that actually was enacted and, unfortunately, in my view, signed by President Clinton. What the statute does, and it's just a short statute, it says that when an agency promulgates a regulation, a major regulation, that it must be reported to Congress and gives both houses of Congress an opportunity to pass a joint resolution, which has to be signed by the president, essentially vetoing the resolution. I'm sorry, essentially vetoing the regulation, that major regulation. So it is a congressional veto, but it must be done through a bicameral mechanism, both houses of Congress, and it does have to comply with the presentment clause, that is, that the president has to sign it. So the idea is that this made what was previously an unconstitutional legislative veto constitutional. So far, no one has challenged the constitutionality of the Congressional Review Act. Now, it does something else.
Now, hold on one second. Before we move to the other provisions of the Congressional Review Act, just explain to people, it would have been unconstitutional under a different scenario. I mean, this is just basically creating a framework to supposedly make it constitutional. It would have been unconstitutional because you would have the legislative branch essentially negating the executive branch's authority. In other words, an act or a law is passed, and then the executive branch has the authority under that existing law to, like you say, promulgate regulations that come out of it. And so this is a way to get around that constitutionality. What is the other aspect of the Congressional Review Act that happens when a regulation is reviewed?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, importantly, is that it tightens up the congressional procedures so that there cannot be a filibuster. So it makes it much easier to get one of these resolutions through Congress. It can't be filibustered. The other thing it does, and this is really a sleeper aspect of it, is the statute then says, the Congressional Review Act then says that once Congress has passed and the president has signed a joint resolution disapproving of a regulation, that agency may not promulgate a regulation that is substantially the same as the regulation that had just been vetoed, absent an act of Congress authorizing the agency to do so. And of course, that act of Congress would be subject to a filibuster.
And so, in other words, you need 2/3 of, I guess. Now, this takes place obviously 2/3 in the Senate, and so it. So, if I understand you correctly, not only does it negate a regulation, and not only does it make it easier, it becomes sort of a privileged legislation, I guess, if you will, to negate this regulation. But then it raises the bar if anybody wants to reinstitute that regulation to a point where in very rare circumstances will you ever see it again. And this is, so here is the question that I have, and then I want to go through. You've listed in your piece a number of these regulations that would have helped. Hundreds, thousands, millions of Americans. But before we get there, I distinctly remember talking about the date of when the Obama administration needed to pass or needed to promulgate these regulations to escape the 60 days of session days. These are not contiguous or business days. They are specifically congressional session days. And people were saying this in 2016, that it was around, I think, June of 2016, so that they could. How did, and there are so many of these, and they are so important, and we will go through them in a moment, but how did the Obama administration allow, and particularly the implications of this, because, this is worse than if the regulations had never been issued at this point, because they're that much harder to bring about in the future. How did the Obama administration allow the clock essentially to run out and promulgate these regulations in the non-safe harbor zone, I guess you could call it?
Oh, you could. What the statute does is it salts the earth.
Right.
Having taken away the regulation, it makes it so it's almost impossible to promulgate a new one on the same topic,
right,
the same subject matter.
So in this instance,
how did the Obama administration allow this to happen?
Well, how did they not? I mean, were they just simply too cocky about the fact that that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election? Or, I mean, shouldn't this be regular practice for any, Republican or Democrat for that matter? I don't know that Republicans are really that interested in promulgating regulations, but shouldn't this be regular practice that, 70 days out, we're not going to 70 session days out, we're not going to promulgate any regulations that we really want to actually exist?
I think the answer to the question is somewhat complicated, but I think the first answer is they were sure they were going to win the election. The second answer is bureaucracies run on their own time schedules with their and it's pretty much the case that they try to push things out toward the end of the administration, even when the people in the White House would prefer that they get them out before this 60 session day period starts running. I think most calculations had it be mid-May of 2016 that these had to be promulgated. And I think in some cases, bureaucracies they do what they do, and they push them on out. When we talk through some of these, who would have imagined that somebody would have wanted to undo teacher accountability regulations, or for God's sakes, who would imagine that you'd want to stop a regulation that required the Social Security Administration to tell the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that does background checks on gun purchases. Who would imagine that somebody would want to overturn a regulation that told the Social Security Administration, tell the background check system when you have determined that someone subject to your care is incompetent to have a gun? So to some extent, there may be a bit of cockiness here, and to some extent, it may have been just a bit of naivete.
I would say naivete. I mean, I'm certainly old enough to remember the Bush administration, and I was aware of the Republican Party prior to May of 2016. So I don't think anybody should have been surprised. But let's take a break, and when we come back, Thomas McGarity will go through some of the most important regulations that were promulgated in the final days of the Obama administration that now have not only been reversed, but as he says, the earth has been salted and it'll be that much harder for them to ever come back. We've got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.